All right, good evening and welcome everyone. I am Brian Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility. PSR mobilizes health professionals and our concerned allies to confront the gravest threats to our health and our planet. We especially work to address the threats of nuclear weapons and climate change. We have tens of thousands of individual members across the country and a network of state and local chapters. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this community of advocates and to tonight's important conversation. Over our 65-year history, PSR has sounded the alarm about the risks of radioactive pollution from nuclear weapons testing, development, and use, and also the radiation risk related to nuclear energy. Now, over the last couple of years, there's been a big push for new state and federal policies in support of nuclear power, and there's been lots of private corporate investment, especially linked to big tech, to the push for artificial intelligence, and the spread of hyperscale data centers across the country. Our local PSR chapters and advocates are responding to these new proposals for nuclear power, supporting research studies of the health risks, intervening in state policy debates, and responding to lots of new project proposals. Many of us are actually in DC this week speaking up about the current administration's proposals to circumvent some of the normal regulatory procedures for nuclear reactors and to weaken health and safety protections for workers and communities. It's really great to see how many of you are also concerned. We have a huge response to the symposium. Over 500 people have registered tonight. So thanks to all of you for taking some time. I know that many of us have questions about nuclear power. And so tonight we have an amazing panel of experts who are going to address some of these and outline some of the significant economic, health, and environmental and safety hazards posed by nuclear power. You'll also hear about some of the safer, more affordable options that can address both the climate crisis and the increasing cost of energy that we're facing in this country. And then we'll conclude tonight by sharing a few concrete things that you can do, including how to get more involved with PSR's work and support our engagement on nuclear power, as well as how you individually can respond to some of these federal proposals to weaken safety standards. So thank you for your engagement, for your attention tonight, and for supporting our work. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Karen Solomon, who's senior deputy editor at the New England Journal of Medicine and associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Thank you and welcome, Karen.
Thanks so much, Brian. And as Brian said, we're really thrilled with the turnout tonight and just want to thank you all for being here. So a few important items of business before we begin. If you have questions during the presentations, we ask that you type them into the Q&A box and then indicate if you'd like to direct your question to a specific speaker. Feel free to submit questions throughout the event, and we're going to do our best to address them after the presentations. Also, a recording of tonight's event will be sent to all those who registered. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Now, in the interest of time, I'm keeping the intros really brief, but you can learn more about the fantastic work these individuals are doing right on the GBPSR website. Dr. Phil Landrigan is a pediatrician and epidemiologist and an expert on the impacts on human health, especially children's health, of hazardous environmental exposures. Dr. Landrigan directs the Global Observatory on Planetary Health at Boston College and co-chaired the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health, and now co-leads the Lancet Countdown on Health and Plastics. Professor Benjamin Sovacool is professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University, where he's the founding director of the Institute for Global Sustainability. He's also professor of energy policy at the Bennett Institute for Innovation and Policy Acceleration at the University of Sussex Business School. Professor M.V. Ramana is Simon's Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. So Dr. Phil Landrigan will start us off by introducing the context in which nuclear power is being pushed and key reasons to question the wisdom of investing in this strategy. Thank you, Phil. Better.
Okay, next slide, please. So here's the context. Firstly, we have rapidly rising demand for electricity. And of course, a major driver of that is the proliferation of AI data centers. Next, next, please. We have global climate change. Next, we have the fact that fossil fuels are being phased down. Next, please. Every time I say next, push a button. We have the current administration opposing renewable energy. So in this context, next button, we have we people have come along, investors in Silicon Valley, uh, uh, various journalists proposing that nuclear power from small modular reactors, SMRs, is a solution that would, like cutting the Gordian knot, slice through all of these problems, solve rising electricity demand, and be a solution to climate change. Next slide, please. Shows an example. Next bullet. This is an article in 2019 when things were just ramping up in the New Yorker, uh, talking about the possibility 5, 6 years ago of moving to nuclear power. The next bullet shows a more recent article from The
Um,
Economist, which portrays small modular reactors as pint-sized power stations, which they're not.
I
But
think we've lost the slides again.
oh
Are
no,
you? This is
Okay.
crazy.
I'm
Yeah,
not.
we're
I'm
able to
not.
see.
I'm not touching them. Somebody else is
Yeah, we're
driving them.
We have the
we're seeing
slides.
them okay, Karen.
You're seeing them?
Yep.
Okay. Wow, because I'm not. Okay, great. I'm sorry.
Okay, so here's an article from 2022 in The Economist, advocating for small modular reactors. The next slide, please, shows an article just from a month ago in The Lancet, of all places, the big medical journal out of the UK, talking about nuclear energy and saying that the chance of something going seriously wrong at one of these plants is extremely small. Next slide, please. And here's Governor Maura Healey of New England. The 6 New England governors in March of this year announced a commitment to move forward with nuclear power. So that is something that the state chapters in the 6 New England states will want to look into. Next bullet, Governor Kathy Hochul in New York has put forth a similar plan. So the New York chapter will want to take note of that. And the next slide is that the World Bank's recent decision to end its fundings for international nuclear projects could spread this enthusiasm globally. Next, please. So there are a series of claims that are made by proponents, by advocates for SMRs. Firstly, that these reactors are safe, clean, and affordable. This claim, next bullet, comes from the U.S. Department of Energy, which is very solidly behind the proliferation of SMRs. The next bullet says that the risks of these reactors are remote and trivial. And that bullet, next comes from the White House from a year ago, from the current federal administration. It's part of their executive order on reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, at the same time as the White House is proposing to deregulate nuclear energy. They're stating that the risks are remote and trivial. Next slide, please. So there are several shortcomings on those claims. I think first and foremost is that the hazard assessment that they talk about focuses very narrowly and specifically on reactor operations. Next bullet. But there are other dangers across the nuclear fuel cycle. So what I'm going to do now is talk about the nuclear fuel cycle and the hazards that surround each of the various stages of the fuel cycle. It's basically a life cycle assessment of the hazards of nuclear power for those folks who are into LCA. Next bullet, please. So one of the problems with a narrow focus on reactor operations is that it ignores the fact that any reactor, including an SMR, produces radioactive waste. In fact, SMRs produce more radioactive waste per kilowatt hour of electricity generated than conventional reactors. Next bullet, please. It claims inaccurately that nuclear power is climate neutral. My colleagues are going to show the data that speak to that point, but it is an inaccurate statement. Next slide, please. It claims it dramatically overlooks the falling costs of renewable energy. Wind and solar costs have fallen dramatically and currently are way below the costs of nuclear energy. Next, please. So the nuclear fuel cycle. Next bullet, please. begins with mining, and the hazards of nuclear energy have to be assessed across the fuel cycle. The next bullet points out that uranium, the fuel of nuclear power, is radioactive, it's carcinogenic. Even the lowest measurable level of exposure to ionizing radiation from uranium causes cancer. Next bullet, please. Uranium miners at the first stage of the fuel cycle are exposed to radon gas, which is present at high level in uranium mines, and they die from lung cancer at increased rates. Next bullet shows that nuclear fuel production exposes those workers to a variety of radioactive compounds, including uranium oxides and radon. Next, please, shows that reactor operators are exposed to radionuclides in workplace air, and some of those radionuclides are vented to the surrounding communities. A report just out recently from the Harvard School of Public Health, in which I'm a co-author, finds that over the last 25 years, 115,000 US cancer deaths could be attributed to living near a nuclear plant. Next, please. All reactors produce nuclear waste. Next bullet shows that when reactors are decommissioned, this radioactive waste can be dispersed because the usual controls break down. This happened recently at the Pilgrim nuclear power station in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where Holtec, the contractor, proposed to dump 1 million gallons of radioactive liquid waste into Cape Cod Bay. When the State Department of Environmental Protection blocked that, they simply evaporated the radioactive waste into the atmosphere. Next bullet, please. Of course, uniquely compared to any other energy source, fossil fuel or wind or solar, nuclear power is unique in its potential for meltdown, its potential for fuel diversion, and its potential for weaponization. Next, please. And it's not climate neutral, as I've already said. Fossil fuels are burned at every stage. Next, please. And finally, nuclear plants are highly vulnerable to climate change. Next, please. Next slide. Nuclear power is not cheap. My colleagues are going to go into this in further detail, but let me give you some headlines. Next bullet, please. Firstly, the analyses of the economic costs of nuclear energy that are out there fail to look at the costs of the disease and the death that occur in consequence of nuclear exposure across the entire fuel cycle. They just don't look at those numbers at all. Next, please. Next, please. Those costs are externalized by the nuclear industry, which is to say that they don't cover those costs themselves. Instead, they offload them onto taxpayers and the public. Current estimates systematically underestimate the costs of nuclear construction. Next bullet shows that the most recent conventional reactor came in at 36.8 billion, which was more than twice its original budget of 14 billion. The cost of each individual SMR has recently more than doubled, almost doubled, I should say, from 5.3 billion to 9.3 billion. Again, these costs are externalized and ratepayers are expected to pick them up. And next bullet, finally, the current estimates do not make any provision, no fiscal set aside for a nuclear disaster. Again, the owners simply assume that those costs will be picked up by the government, which means by the taxpayers. Next slide, please. Final point, nuclear power is not necessary. Next bullet, please. The costs of wind and solar have just plummeted in recent years. Next bullet, please. Wind is down 90% since 2010. Wind is down by about 60 or 70%. Battery costs are down by 97%. Next bullet, please. In many parts of the US, it's now cheaper to generate electricity from renewables. Next bullet, please. And in this context, nuclear power is economically viable only when it is propped up by the government with subsidies, with tax breaks, with liability exemptions that absolve the industry from any responsibility if anything goes wrong. Next slide, please. And here's a slide showing how in places around the world, the cost of producing electricity from sun and wind has come way, way down. In many places, it's cheaper than fossil electricity and certainly cheaper than nuclear electricity. And the next slide shows similarly that the next one shows that the cost of batteries have also come way down while the quality of the batteries keeps rising. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, my final slide, my conclusion is that nuclear energy is neither a wise solution nor a sound investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Um, I guess I will next introduce, Dr. Sovacool will be speaking next and will talk to us about the economics and fossil fuel emissions compared across energy sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope my slides are working and everyone can see me so we can proceed. So it's really nice to be here. It's also one of these rare presentations where I get to kind of flout my three affiliations because they all relate to different elements of nuclear power. I am a professor of energy policy, so I'm very familiar with some of the energy security implications of nuclear power versus renewables and efficiency. I'm a professor of Earth and Environment, so I'm very much kind of researching the externalities, the land use impacts, the water risks, and other risks to the environment that nuclear power plants pose. And I'm also a distinguished professor of Business and Social Sciences, so it's all about the economics of nuclear power or some of the financial risks. And I always like to start that unbelievably, although I've had some success with lots of grants, I have never had a nuclear power project. And I think that that actually may be a strength because it allows me to kind of be truly dispassionate, nonpartisan, and objective. I'm not funded by the renewable energy industry. I'm not funded by a government. I don't have any shares in renewable energy or nuclear power, right? And so I kind of have told my students, like, all these papers I'm going to present are actually hobbies of mine, things I decided to do on the side because I was curious and because I thought it was really important. Also, and this is really, really key, everything I'm about to share with you is fully peer reviewed, is also transparent, and we've shared all of the data sets, which is another issue that's really important anytime you're talking about governance and transparency for something as important and controversial as nuclear power. So I don't have a lot of time. I wanted to kind of focus on just a few important dimensions. One of them is that nuclear power does have low carbon emissions, but it still has carbon emissions. And so all of these people and advocates that say nuclear is carbon free are wrong. Because, as was mentioned earlier, nuclear does have a fuel cycle. And we did a meta analysis of 103 studies about 10, 15 years ago of nuclear power and found that that corpus of evidence was pretty bad. A lot of studies were too old, or they weren't very detailed, or they had inferior methodology, or they did not share their data, or were not accessible in English language format. So we kind of looked at the best 19 studies at that time that were weighted equally across both of the nuclear fuel cycles you can see here, the kind of once through nuclear fuel cycle that the United States uses, the kind of closed nuclear fuel cycle that France and Japan and others use. And we found that nuclear power has a mean carbon footprint of about 66 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Interestingly, the largest chunk of that is not construction or decommissioning, but the front end of the cycle where you have uranium mining. And I'm sure the next question is, well, what the heck does 66 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour mean? It puts nuclear right here. So it is definitely suitable as a low carbon option, right? Look at it compared to coal or natural gas or even hydrogen, but it is not as good as things like solar or biomass or wind. So there's a key debate in terms of climate change where we draw the line on what low emissions technologies are. Is it everything with solar PV and below, or is it nuclear and below? I think we can all agree that gas and oil and coal are not low carbon. We then did a more national study that wasn't based on the literature, and it was instead based on our own data set. We looked at IAEA data, so no one could accuse us of bias. We looked at the International Atomic Energy Agency's data from 123 years, and we asked this question, do countries that pursue renewable energy have greater emissions reductions than those that only pursue nuclear power, or vice versa? And I teamed up with the great Andy Sterling and then two data analysis and statisticians in Germany. And we found that those countries that pursue renewables have statistically significantly greater levels of carbon emissions than nuclear power. We also found that countries that pursue nuclear power tend not to pursue renewable energy and vice versa. In other words, they're mutually exclusive or they crowd each other out because the subsidies, the technological capabilities, the RD&D networks kind of can only do one. There's only so much financial capacity, technological capacity that they're almost mutually exclusive, which then means this notion of a portfolio approach where you do nuclear with renewables may be false, and it's about policymakers not doing everything, but choosing between nuclear and renewables. So that's the first argument on carbon. Renewables are better, they have fewer emissions for their life cycle, and countries that adopt renewable strategies have faster emissions reductions than nuclear power plants. The second element may sound really boring, financial risks, but it's actually really important as well. We built an original data set across 83 countries looking at how long it takes to build energy infrastructure, and we looked at a whole range of energy infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants, thermoelectric plants, that's coal and gas and oil, solar PV and wind farms. And in our sample was 180 nuclear reactors with about $500 billion of investment. So a pretty rigorous data set. And we found 97.2% of nuclear plants have a cost overrun. That's almost 100%. So 97 out of 100 will cost more than you think, and the average amount that they'll cost is more than 100%. So in simple terms, 97% of nuclear plants will have an overrun, and it will cost you twice as much as you initially budgeted. And even newer phenomena like Hinkley Point C in the UK or some of the new reactors in Finland or Sweden are having overruns of 700 to 800%. They also have a mean construction time of 88 months. And as I like to put this into perspective, it took us longer, it takes us longer to build a nuclear power plant than it did to fight World War II. The third dimension is safety and accidents. I teamed up here with Didier Sornet at ETH Zurich, who is a master of probabilities and looking at catastrophic risks like volcanic eruptions and financial collapses and political collapses and pandemics. We teamed up to do two studies in risk analysis and energy research and social science, also using a great database that was compiled from the IAEA, where we looked at 216 nuclear events. That's an accident or an incident, which was data set was twice as large at the time of the study as that was best in operation before. And again, here is the headline. It is more likely or not that there will be another 3 Mile Island event in the next 20 years, and it is more likely as not that there will be another Fukushima event in the next century because humans make mistakes and there is no such thing as risk-free energy. We also estimate that there's a frequency of about 0.003 significant events per plant per year, but because they're always operating 24/7 for years and years and years, that does create probable risks. And we find that the average cost of those events is about $2 billion a year, which at the time of the study was the cost of a new nuclear power plant. So again, these are not negligible or trivial accident risks, even if they don't lead to a Fukushima or Chernobyl-like event. The fourth dimension is the kind of externalities or the hidden social costs. And here again, another study, we did an independent meta-analysis of 139 studies over 30 years that had 704 different estimations for the hidden social costs of energy systems. We looked at a whole variety of them, from raw materials and mining to construction to supply to waste flows. And you can see here in the color, we didn't just look at things like air pollution and climate change. We looked at catastrophic or chronic accidents. We looked at noise and water use and occupational health, all with a variety of different methods like choice experiments and contingent valuation and impact pathway assessments. We found that the average electricity kilowatt hour has 7.15 cents of externalities. Nuclear is a little better than the average. You can see it there in that kind of lighter red box at 5.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Why? Because it's better than coal and oil. and some of the dirtier fossil fuels, but again, not quite as good as some of the cleaner renewables. This shows you the full range of the data, so you can kind of see nuclear there does have higher ranges of externalities as you go up, but it's not doing quite so as good as, say, hydro or geothermal or wind power. You can also see that the majority of those of externalities are climate change and air pollution, although there were a few others like land and deforestation, or things like aesthetics and lower property values, or the risk of chronic accidents. This does mean that the electricity system is a huge generator of externalities across the whole energy system. It's $11.6 trillion, about 10% of global GDP. This ironically exceeds the revenues for electricity sales around the world, and it also exceeds oil and gas production, and it's also greater than the levelized cost of energy. This suggests that electricity is a market failure because its price does not match its cost. Nuclear's externalities, if you tease those out, you take the 5.63 cents from our meta-analysis and you multiply it by the trillions of kilowatt hours that it had last year, and it's producing about $150 billion of externalities a year. Not into the trillions, so it's not as bad as coal and oil, but it's still $150 billion that taxpayers and consumers have to suffer through as they grapple with those externalities. Ironically, the only energy system that had a positive externality, a net positive one, was energy efficiency and demand response, which we think is a great substitute for any sort of power plant. As Amory Lovins used to say, the best power plant is the one you never have to build because you've actually lowered energy intensity and improved energy efficiency. So to wrap it up, what does this mean? Well, for this discussion today, nuclear energy is low carbon, but it is not carbon free. It is probably dirtier than many of its advocates promote because they'll often tout studies that only looked at European reactors or only looked at Canadian reactors, not a global data set of reactors that included China and India and a whole variety of other reactors that have been idle or have had, issues of maintenance or incidents and accidents. However, this number of 66 grams per kilowatt hour will only get worse. I didn't talk about that, but in our paper, we talk about it will get worse for three reasons. Number one, we've already gone through a large amount of nuclear weapons recycling into fuel, which we won't be doing in the future. And now we've come back to making new nuclear weapons. And so what was once a source of like almost low cost uranium or plutonium is now going the other way. Number two, we've already mined the best uranium mines with the highest grade ores. And so future mining is going to be more energy intensive. And we'll also have to shift to less ideal reserves. In fact, even now, uranium mining has some emissions profiles that are the same as methane emissions from natural gas, which are quite bad. And third, the carbon footprint will change if we actually start to do SMRs, because as Professor Ramana will talk about, they have higher energy intensities and therefore likely greater emissions intensities. So all of these things are pushing the carbon footprint of nuclear towards greater and higher levels, which are bad, not lower levels. Nuclear energy will almost always cost you more than you think. It'll cost you twice as much, and it will take you as long as a world war to build, even if it performs well and doesn't suffer an accident or an incident. We really need to fight this false discourse that nuclear is safe. No energy system is safe. Even solar PV is not safe. People get electrocuted installing it. They fall off of roofs. There have been car crashes with people behind trucks with panels and so forth. So it will never be free of these types of accident risks. And I didn't even talk about some of the other risks like weapons proliferation or terrorist attacks on plants or terrorists threatening to attack spent fuel facilities. So these risks will always have to be managed, and they'll have to be managed in perpetuity because even once the nuclear reactor shuts down, we'll still have to manage spent fuel and we'll still have to decommission sites that could be radioactive and thus prone to all sorts of malicious acts. And then lastly, nuclear power does have about 5 cents of hidden social costs for every single kilowatt hour that it produces. This is not as large as those from wind and solar or hydro, which are like 1 cent and so forth. And it will continue, these costs will be continue to be borne by all of us, by society, in the form of blighted landscapes and hidden surcharges for decommissioning and potential air pollution and potential uranium mining tailings contaminating ecosystems and so forth. So it's not that we pay and suffer, just not on our energy bills. And with that, I'll happily turn it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have a final talk, and then we're going to have time for a Q&A. So our final talk is Professor Ramana, who will be actually telling us quite a bit about SMRs.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you all for inviting me to speak. It's my great privilege to join Benjamin and Phil in this. I'm going to sort of step back a little bit to give you a big picture of where we are with nuclear power before I get into the question of SMRs, because that helps you understand why there's even talk about SMRs. So if you look around the world, there are roughly around 400 odd nuclear reactors that are operating. And these have been built over the decades, starting in 1954 when the first nuclear reactor was connected to the grid in the Soviet Union. And this graph here is of all the numbers of nuclear reactors that were connected to the grid each year. So the blue marks are the ones when a new reactor was connected to the grid. And then the brown marks underneath the black line are the years when there were some reactors that were shut down and therefore taken off the grid. And what this picture shows you is that the vast majority of the nuclear reactors that were built have been built before the 1980s. And the maximum numbers of reactors that were connected to the grid were in 1984 and 1985, about 33 reactors. And subsequently, there's been a dramatic decline in the rate at which nuclear reactors are constructed. And then there are also some years when more nuclear reactors have been taken off the grid than have been added to that. So the net result of the fact that there is not a lot of nuclear reactor construction and some reactors are being retired either because they are old or because one of their components has developed some kind of a defect and has to be replaced or whatever, is that the net result of these two factors is that the nuclear fleet is roughly constant since the 1990s, the number of nuclear reactors operating around the world. It goes up and down a little bit, but it's more or less constant. But in the meantime, other sources of power have been added to the grid. It's not that the electricity demand has stopped. And so the result is that the share of global electricity produced by nuclear power plants has been declining consistently since the mid 1990s. That's what the graph on the right hand top graph shows. The blue line is the share of global electricity, and you see that it's roughly about 50% below what it was in the mid 1990s. And in contrast, modern renewables, things like wind and solar and biomass and so on, has been growing very, very fast. So globally, they produce nearly double the amount of electricity that nuclear power plants produce. This is the last amount of data is from 2024. And the expectation is that the 2025 data is not yet out, but when it comes out, it'll show an even greater difference between how much share nuclear power plants will have and renewables have. And likewise, in the United States as well, what you see is that modern renewables have taken over as producing more energy, more electricity than nuclear reactors. And the reason why this is happening is fairly simple. The cost of nuclear power is much higher than other source of power. So this particular graph here shows the data on what is the estimated cost of a new power plant in the United States. It's produced by a Wall Street company called Lazard, and they produce these estimates every year. And what we see here are two things. One is that the most expensive way to generate power in the United States, if you're going to build a new power plant of any kind, will be a nuclear plant. And that the cost of generating electricity at one of them is around $180 per megawatt hour. In contrast, the cost of generating power from a new solar utility scale plant or a wind plant is around $60 per megawatt hour. So it's roughly about 3 times as expensive. And that the while solar and wind costs have largely been declining, the cost of nuclear generation has actually been increasing with time. And the primary reason this is the nuclear power costs so much is that nuclear reactors cost a lot to build. And you can understand why nuclear plants cost a lot, because ultimately a nuclear plant is just a very complicated way to boil water. And if you look at the costs of recent plants, I mean, both Phil and Benjamin have explained that the costs typically increase much more than what are initially estimated. And we saw this in the case of the last nuclear plant that was built in the United States, the Vogtle plant, which cost roughly $37 billion, $36.8 billion. And there are similar experiences in the UK, in the France. These are all countries which have built large numbers of nuclear reactors. So these are not newcomers to this game. And the Vogtle project, the final cost was around 37 billion, but that went up from $14 billion. That was the 14 billion was the cost estimate when construction started in the mid 2010s. And at that time, it was also expected to start in 2016 or 17, but the actual starts of the two Vogtle reactors were in 2023-24. Now, I also want to say one more thing about the cost increase, which is that the $14 billion cost estimate when construction started was itself up from around $5 billion, which was what the Westinghouse Corporation, the company that designed this nuclear plant, was testifying in Senate hearings and so on in the first decade of the century, when there was a lot of talk about a nuclear renaissance. And the Bush administration passed an Energy Policy Act. And that was based on the idea that these new reactors were going to cost about 5 to 6 billion. But from 5 to 6 billion, it went up to 14 billion to 37 billion. So this is a pattern that we're going to be, that we have seen many, many times. So small modular reactors are being proposed as a potential solution to this particular challenge. And the question is, can they really change this picture? So I'll just say one brief bit about what small modular reactors are. There are two terms here, small and modular. Small just means that the amount of power these will generate is under 300 megawatts. In comparison, the Vogtle nuclear reactors that I talked about in Georgia generate about 1100 megawatts each. The small has nothing to do with the physical size of the reactor. That depends on the kind of design, and the graph in the bottom shows one particular measure of the size of a reactor, and you see it varies quite a lot between different kinds of designs. The second term here is the term modular, which just basically means that you try to build a nuclear reactor the same way you would build a shopping center or an office complex today, which is not by bringing bricks and wood to the site, but taking factory manufactured modules and assembling it on site. So it's exactly the same process. And this was the process that was used to build the Vogtle nuclear reactor in Georgia. And so modularity is not something which is, revolutionarily new. And so the research that my former colleague Zia Mian and I did, we looked at a whole number of different small modular reactor designs. And what we found was that no single SMR design can meet all of the desirable goals for a nuclear reactor design. We would like a nuclear reactor to have a low probability of a severe accident, not produce much radioactive waste, be less proliferation, be less likely to contribute to nuclear weapons proliferation, and most importantly, be cheap. And if you look at any design, these kind of requirements are pulling the designers in different directions. So no designer can come up with a design that can actually meet all these criteria. In particular, when you go to smaller reactors, the cost per unit of power capacity or electricity generated is going to be greater because it loses out on what are called economies of scale. And this is a well-known principle, just says that if you want to build a reactor that produces 5 times as much electricity, you don't need 5 times as much concrete or needs 5 times as many workers. And so that makes it cheaper per unit. And we see that these diseconomies of scale being shown in the kinds of nuclear reactor, a small modular reactor proposals that we have seen around the world. Even the initial cost estimates are much greater than the corresponding cost estimates for large reactors. And because of that, when you try to translate it into the cost of electricity, you see that the cost of power from SMRs is much greater than renewables. In this particular graph, the big black bar that is in the center is their cost estimate for electricity from small modular reactors. In comparison, wind and solar are down here, including when you have a grid that is largely powered up to 90% from variable renewables like solar and wind. I'll just finish by saying small modular reactors are also susceptible to severe accidents. There are good reasons, theoretical reasons why you can never predict all possible ways in which a nuclear reactor can suffer an accident. That doesn't mean that accidents are going to be frequent. It just means that you can never rule them out. But if one of these reactors has an accident, then the costs of cleanup can be extremely high. And this is something which is actually going to be made worse by the kind of recent proposals made by the Trump administration talking about quote unquote reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which basically means that the Regulatory Commission is supposed to license new reactor designs on a fairly rapid and arbitrary timescale. The administration has been underplaying the risks of exposure to radiation. They want to use some kind of pseudo-scientific theory that low levels of radiation are actually good for you, or something along those lines, basically going against science in various ways. And also they want to sort of accelerate the licensing of new reactor types like small modular reactors, for which we don't have enough operational experience. The second challenge, and this is mixed worse by the kinds of governmental priorities, such as what the Trump administration is doing, such as what China and India have done, the sort of overconfidence on the part of designers and regulatory failures. There's also the connection between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and I can explain more about why these are deeply imbricated with each other during the question and answer session. And finally, small modular reactors, like all nuclear reactors, produce radioactive waste that remain hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. And there is no way to actually be completely sure that this kind of material will never come into contact with future human beings, both because of the very long time scale, so you cannot really make predictions about it, and because the experience we've had with repositories that have been constructed, such as the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, was that there was we cannot foresee all possible accidents at these kinds of sites. So at the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, there was an explosion involving a cask that had plutonium in it that had completely not been envisioned by the designers. And that was the most expensive accident in the DOE's, Department of Energy's history. And so for a number of reasons, you have to be, small modular reactors also will produce this waste that we don't have a good solution for. I'll end there, and thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions along with Benjamin and Phil.
Thanks so much. So we don't have a lot of time, but we have a lot of great questions. So I'm going to, start to at least get to some of them. So I'm going to start actually with Benjamin. Two people asked about effects on external costs of considering future generations, costs of waste management from reactors, and potential damages. And so a question is sort of, are these factored into these cost estimates? Are they discounted? Can you sort of say a little bit more about that?
A nice easy one. Yes and yes. So they are factored in. Obviously, not all of the studies looked at the whole nuclear fuel cycle. Some of those would only look at nuclear power generation, some maybe construction, but there were others that also looked at uranium mining and also those that looked at waste. And yes, although they have a variety of methods, many of the studies heavily discounted impacts into the future, which is arguably unethical from a future generation's perspective, but it is a common technique. We didn't normalize, weight, or correct any of the studies. We just synthesized the evidence. So those biases in the literature would still be present. The other interesting thing, Karen, not only did they discount the future, almost all externality studies were just of one site. So very few looked at portfolios of, say, nuclear fleets all across a country or across a region, which could even magnify externalities.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. Now, Phil, I have one for you, which is, can you say something about the need for water for cooling reactors and then specifically risks to nuclear reactors from climate change?
Yes. So about water, um, nuclear plants require very large quantities of water to cool them. And so if there is a drought, there is not sufficient water and nuclear plants have to shut down. That happened a couple of years ago in Germany, when there was a drought coupled with a heat wave. A number of nuclear plants had to shut down, and actually, what saved the grid in that context was massive output of solar electricity that stabilized the grid. So another problem with lots of nuclear plants are built in low-lying areas, along coasts, along rivers. And so as sea levels rise, as the oceans get warmer under the influence of global climate change, more and more nuclear plants are going to be at risk of coastal flooding.
No, thank you. That's a really important piece of this. I'm looking through, there's just a lot of really good questions here. I guess one that we had from earlier that I want to ask Ramana as I pour through some others, but is kind of now that you've told us a good bit about SMRs, I guess the question is, sort of overall the practicality of relying on them, kind of what's the experience? You said a little bit about that. And do you, you've told us a lot of reasons why they don't seem super practical, and I guess if you could kind of sum that
Yeah.
up, it would be really
So,
helpful.
there have been a few small modular reactors built around the world. In Russia and China in particular, there's one whose construction is just about starting in Canada. And all of these have displayed exactly the same kind of challenges we see with large reactors. So the Russian one, for example, was supposed to be built in 3 years. It took closer to 13 years. And the time it took, I mean, the cost also sort of ballooned up. The same in the case of China, where, China is actually very good at controlling costs and times, but in this particular case, it didn't. These were high temperature gas cooled reactors. And what's more important is that once these were commissioned, they have been the whatever data we are getting about how well they are operating has been pretty poor. The power rating was reduced from 200 megawatts to 150 megawatts with no explanation why that was reduced. And the amount of electricity they seem to be producing is what you expect from these if they are operating for 1 month a year, basically. So the practically it doesn't seem to be that they are doing extremely well.
Thank you. Um, so I want to actually ask another sort of health-related question to Phil, which is whether you could talk just a little bit about special vulnerabilities to radiation during particular windows of the lifestyle, and kind of how much we know about that and how much that might affect these sort of estimates of health impact.
Well, we certainly know in general that humans are most vulnerable to environmental hazards during the early stages of development, which means during the 9 months of pregnancy and in the first few years after birth. And the reason for that is that babies breathe about 4 times as much air per kilogram of body weight as adults. They drink about 7 times as much water. They eat more food per pound. So that if there is any radioactive waste in air, in food, in water, infants are disproportionately exposed. And because their tissues are growing and developing, they're arguably more sensitive to ionizing radiation than mature tissues.
Thank you. Ben, one for you, and others may want to weigh on this as well, but we are asked, what about the argument that we need to use every viable energy source? Because we're obviously hearing that a lot in Massachusetts now, right? We need everything and we'll have a sprinkling of each. Okay, to decrease our emissions over the next 50 to 60 years when we can finally, I guess, use wind again or what have you. So, what about that? Do you what's your take on that, that we kind of need everything?
So our study that talked about nuclear and renewable pathways being mutually exclusive is very telling here. It kind of supposes that you can't. And it also supposes that all options of the portfolio are qualitatively similar, but they're not. Like the kind of technological dynamics of nuclear power are so unlike that of solar photovoltaics or offshore wind or even coal. So it's not like we can all put these pieces on a checkerboard and play checkers. Instead, it's like putting chess pieces on a checkers board. It doesn't make any sense because they don't qualitatively match. The other thing too is that um, we don't need all the options. You know, nuclear power costs twice as much, takes 7 or 8 years to build, and it has levelized costs, as Ramana was pointing out, that are, 20, 30, 40 cents per kilowatt hour. As we said in one of our articles, it's like fighting world hunger with caviar. You could do it, but you shouldn't do it. And I also want to point out the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has a beautiful synthesis diagram from their last assessment report in 2022 that lists about 40 options that we have to mitigate climate change at scale. Wind, solar, hydro, energy efficiency, fuel switching, etc. Nuclear is one of the smallest ones, and SMRs are not even mentioned because the IPCC is telling us they're too late. We will not have them to reach our midterm or far-term energy goals. And then lastly, you may have noticed the nice purple color on my slides. I was director of the Center on Innovation and Energy Demand, and we did a beautiful study a few years ago, which I can share with Oxford University and UKIRC, which is the UK Energy Research Centre, that found if the UK just enforced their building performance standards for residential buildings, you would displace the need for 6 Hinkley Point C nuclear power plants cost effectively. So demand response and energy efficiency, to me, are one of the first places you should go before you ever even consider supply, let alone nuclear supply.
Okay, great. Thank you. There are so many more good questions, but I see that time is short. So I'm going to ask you guys all a quick last question, which is if each of you could just share one brief takeaway that you want people in the audience to have, either for advocating to their legislators or maybe for holding on to some hope or whatever it be. So I'm going to start with Ramana.
There's a lot to say. I would just summarize my thoughts by saying we should be thinking about how to phase out nuclear power and build up a world that is powered by renewables. And this is possible. And we have to, the point is not to say the world is this way and can renewables do it, but more how do we make the world only powered by renewables, and how do we change our demand patterns and all our other uses for energy to meet the ups and downs of renewables.
Thank you. Benjamin?
Yeah, I would say we need more risk-aware electricity planning. And so there's a great study by Binz et al. That looked at levelized cost of energy, which now everyone uses to rank order energy systems. And nuclear power looks okay there. But then if you start to factor in risks, accidents, water use, financial cost overruns, etc., nuclear actually is as risky as coal. It's one of the two riskiest sources. So I think going beyond just cost, looking at the full suite of risks so we get an apples to apples comparison will really reveal where nuclear may be competitive, but in most of the situations where it just won't be because its advocates are hiding those risks.
Thank you. And Phil, brief words of wisdom.
Thank you, Karen. I want to make a pitch for the importance of state level action. Not all power in the United States is in Washington. The states have an enormous amount of control over the siting and the permitting of nuclear plants. I think we're in a situation right now where there's hyper enthusiasm, where there's overconfidence with the 6 New England governors, the governor of the state of New York, all saying we need to go nuclear. I think it's time for the PSR chapters and all concerned citizens in every one of the 50 states, all the Canadian provinces, to speak out against the need for nuclear power, citing all the arguments that my colleagues have marshaled this evening.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank all of you for your fantastic presentations and the discussion. I want to thank the audience for joining us. And as we're aiming for a rapid transition off fossil fuels, I would just say that all the information that you have shared tonight about nuclear energy as a proposed alternative to fossil fuels has been really eye-opening. And I think you've beautifully underscored the risks, the costs, and the impracticality relative to solar and wind. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So just to wrap up, really appreciate all of our outstanding speakers tonight for the presentations, for this conversation and responses to some of the questions. And thanks, Dr. Solomon, for moderating this important discussion. So thanks also to all of you who joined. Like I said, we have over 500 people who registered. We had an amazing long list of great questions. So there's clearly really strong interest in this. I think that speaks to what Phil and others were just saying. We need you engaged in these issues. Stay tuned. I think we can tell there's interest in more conversations like this, both from a national level as well as our chapters. And I really want to thank our chapter network PSR groups across the country who co-sponsored tonight. And yeah, there's lots of ways you can be engaged with them at the local level as well as our national work. So, as was mentioned, there are some great opportunities coming up for you to take action. In July, we expect to hear the proposed rule that will weaken radiation standards from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so everybody who's registered for tonight, we'll send you email updates when that public comment period opens. This is also a great time for public officials to hear from you, whether it's members of Congress, people at the state level. We want the decision makers to know that we're paying attention and that we're concerned and that we have questions. And so we'll send you information about that, as well as how you can get involved in our local chapters, in our national work, and in a new effort that PSR is helping to lead along with many partners, the Coalition to Stop Radioactive Pollution. So we'll be sharing information about all of that. And I'll just wrap up by saying we're clearly up against some powerful and well-funded and well-connected proponents of nuclear energy. And there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding. And we need people power right now. We need you. And we thank you for your participation tonight. And we also thank you for helping support PSR so that we can grow our capacity and grow this movement to meet the moment. This is clearly a time when we're seeing a new wave of support for a new generation of nuclear weapons, but also of nuclear power plants. And we need experts like we heard tonight, but we also need lots and lots of citizens across the country paying attention and speaking up. So thank you for your support and engagement, and look forward to being in touch with you as part of this growing movement. So thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.